By 1688, Britain's economy was strong, especially considering the issues it had faced just 40 years before with civil war, regicide, and religious conflict. In 1688, those engaged in trade were richer than they had ever been. In 1688, Edward Lloyd began inviting merchants and ship owners to his coffee house in London, where they shared crucial shipping news and discussed insurance deals. Today, this coffee house is the oldest insurance market in the world, Lloyd's of London. However, the economic powerhouse of Britain was not just based on banks and insurers. The royal economy was essential to ensure no bouts of famine. The Navigation Acts of the 17th century and the wars over shipping rights with the Dutch will end with one of the most important mergers in history, that of the English and of the Dutch, with the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The intention of this lecture is for you to inquire into impacts on the economy over the 17th century, beginning with the agricultural techniques. Knowledge-wise, you will be able to explain the changes to agricultural techniques over the 17th century. Skills-wise, analyse the process of change over time. And behaviourally, consider the importance of evidence in reaching conclusions in history. A number of new crops arrived in Britain, including artichokes, asparagus, and clover. There was a revolution in eating habits and improvements in soil fertility. For those who could afford it, the heavy bread-based diet was replaced. The population growth we had looked at required guaranteed good harvests within a more effective agricultural output. To be able to feed the growing cities, new techniques were required which were more efficient. The development of market gardens outside of London were important in the feeding of the cities, especially London. Market gardens were specialist producers of fruit and vegetables for sale. Using techniques from Dutch Protestant refugees, such as the use of manure, market gardens were very profitable. By the 1640s, agricultural production in Britain had exceeded all other European countries except Holland. By 1700, the average number of days worked per agricultural family was 405, compared with 266 in 1450. This highlights the growth of population and the correspondent boost of production, plus the drive for efficiency. By 1700, Britain was the biggest producer and exporter of grain. The key question is how, then, did this revolution in all areas of agriculture come about? One of the major changes to the structure of rural life was the enclosure of land. Enclosure involved consolidating scattered land into one area and fencing it off. This reduced competition in areas as enclosed land belonged to a single individual in each region or area. Enclosure was not new and had been happening since the medieval period, where common land was fenced off for the grazing of sheep. However, enclosure sped up in the 17th century. Many saw it as an opportunity to break away from subsistence farming, and as enclosed areas grew, freeholders, people who own the land and have the right to dispose of it as they wish, found it increasingly difficult to compete and became indebted. More modern farming techniques began under the Tudors and increased under the Stuarts. Increased literacy levels after 1600 meant many yeomen and husbandmen made use of technical manuals. With this came the idea of crop rotation, or field rotation, to increase the fertility of the land. The increased use of nitrogen-rich crops, as suggested by the German-born writer Samuel Hartlib, such as clover, also meant the land became fertile quicker. Enclosure helped those techniques to be implemented. Traditionally, 1 out of 3 fields was left to pasture for the nutrients to be restored to the soil. After enclosure, more fields were available, leading to better yields. Immigrant workers from the Netherlands brought skills with them that increased yields, and farmland such as the reclaimed land in East Anglia. The growth of crops from industry, flax for linen, hemp for rope, and hops for beer, benefited greatly from crop rotation. Water meadows had existed for at least 100 years before 1625. They worked by diverting nearby running water into a field. This ensured land was damp, reducing the impact of frost, increasing grass growth for arable purposes, and then harvested for hay, ensuring the animals were well fed for the winter. This enabled more working animals, increasing productivity. Enclosure also meant that single breeds of sheep and cattle could be kept together, and those sheep who produced the most wool could be bred for the cloth industry. The number of working animals also increased. In 1700, there were around 630,000 horses, an increase of 300,000 the century beforehand. Horses also replaced oxen because they were quicker and lived longer. New techniques led to specialized farming. By understanding the country better, certain areas of the country specialized in certain produce more suited to local conditions. Before the 17th century, there were no national markets for agricultural products, and farms generally produced what the local area needed. This was supported by an improved transport infrastructure, and national markets became a larger possibility. Specialized farming helped the yeomanry the most. Owning a large amount of land, they were generally sheltered from poor harvests, and as a result able to experiment with techniques and crops. Husbandmen had a more mixed fortune. With smaller farms, they were less able to exploit the opportunities of national markets, producing too little to make substantial profits. Tenants suffered because of enclosure, and small holdings became unsustainable against the larger farms. Many became wage-dependent labourers on farms and in the cloth industry, or both to be able to feed their families. The Settlement Act of 1662 made it easier to employ people from out of town for the harvest and let them go as a burden on their hometown. As towns and ports grew, more stable employment grew. However, if you had not completed a 7-year apprenticeship, job security was poor. There happened over the 17th century a process of enclosure, followed by the employment of the local poor on large farms, which became well established. The intention of this lecture was for you to begin the inquiry by exploring agricultural techniques and the impacts on the economy over the 17th century. Knowledge-wise, you are able to explain the changes to agricultural techniques over the 17th century. Using the associated material, you will, skills-wise, analyse the process of change over time, and behaviourally, consider the importance of evidence in reaching conclusions in history by using the sources in the associated material. Now complete the associated material.